The night had fallen so suddenly that it felt as if the sky had closed its doors, shutting out the last trace of warmth. Wind roared across the open fields, dragging wild flurries of snow that moved like ghosts across the frozen ground. Anyone with sense had taken shelter hours ago, locking doors and sealing windows as the temperature dropped toward -30. Nothing living was expected to survive out in that cold. Not with the way the storm bit through layers and stripped breath right out of a person's chest. Yet somewhere beyond the fences and the familiar shape of the old farmhouse, something moved against the wind, struggling step by step toward a single light glowing faintly through the icy dark. Inside the farmhouse, the farmer sat near the stove, rubbing his hands together as the fire crackled low. His day had been long, full of chores made harder by the rising storm. He had planned on resting early, but the wind kept slamming the shutters, rattling them like impatient fingers. It made him uneasy. Nights like this didn't come often, and when they did, trouble usually followed. He glanced toward the window more than once, though nothing could be seen beyond the frost-covered glass. Even so, he had a feeling that something out there was trying to push its way into his thoughts, almost as if the storm carried a message he hadn't yet understood. The wind howled louder, and he rose to add more wood to the fire. Flames jumped higher, casting warm light across the room. The quiet inside contrasted sharply with the chaos outside, creating a space where time felt slow and heavy. Then faintly he heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. He paused, listening. At first he thought it was the wind shifting direction. But then it came again, clearer this time. It was something like a cry, but not human. It held strain, fear, and an odd sense of determination. He went still. Nothing cried out in weather like this unless it was desperate. He walked to the door, hesitating with his hand on the handle. Opening it would send frigid air slicing through the house. But ignoring the sound tugged at him in a different way, pulling at his sense of duty. With a deep breath, he unlatched the door and pushed it open. Instantly, icy air blasted in, cutting through the room and making the lamp flicker. Snow swirled violently outside, but through the twisting white he saw a shape standing near the fence. At first, he couldn't make it out. Then the shape lifted its head, and the dim light revealed a pair of dark, shining eyes staring straight at him. His breath caught. A wild horse stood only a few yards from his porch, its coat crusted with frost, steam rising from its body as it shivered against the cold. The animal looked exhausted, as though it had wandered far past its limits. Its sides heaved, each breath a battle. What startled the farmer more than the sight of a horse in such conditions was the horse's expression. Wild horses were cautious, flighty, always ready to bolt at the slightest movement. But this one didn't run, didn't turn away. Instead, it stepped forward, slow and unsure, stopping only when it reached the lowest fence rail. The horse lowered its head as if asking for help. For a moment, the farmer stood frozen, uncertain whether he was seeing something real or just a shape formed by storm and shadows. But the horse's trembling breath and the dull ache visible in its tired eyes were real enough to bring him back to his senses. He stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking into the snow that had piled up across the wooden boards. The horse watched him closely, ears twitching, but made no move to flee. Something in its posture suggested it had run out of options. This was its last hope. The farmer knew the dangers. Bringing a wild horse near meant risk. Even in its weakened state, one wrong move could send its hooves flying. But leaving it out there meant it would not survive the night. The cold was too severe, the storm too relentless. Any creature caught in it without shelter would surely collapse. And although he had every reason to turn back inside, every instinct told him not to. He took one careful step off the porch, snow crunching beneath him. The horse let out a low breath, more like a sigh than a warning. The farmer reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of dried feed he kept on hand for emergencies. He extended his hand slowly. The horse sniffed the air, nostrils flaring. Its legs trembled as it leaned forward, drawn by hunger and exhaustion. After a few long seconds, it took the feed from his hand, breathing warm air against his skin. The moment felt strangely significant, as if the storm itself paused around them, watching the exchange. The farmer knew he needed to bring the horse into shelter, but moving it would be another challenge. Still, the way it had approached him spoke of trust, or at least a desperate attempt to find it. He guided the horse toward the barn, walking slowly so it wouldn't panic. The horse followed, though its steps wavered. More than once it stumbled, forcing the farmer to steady it with a gentle touch. Each time it regained its balance, it looked at him with a gaze that carried both gratitude and fear. By the time they reached the barn, the wind had grown sharp enough to sting his face. He pushed open the barn door, letting warm air spill out. Inside, the light from the lantern cast a soft glow on the hay and wooden stalls. The horse hesitated at the doorway, sensing the unfamiliar space. The farmer whispered calm words, hoping his tone would be enough. After a long moment, the horse stepped inside, its hooves brushing lightly against the straw. Once behind closed doors, the animal finally relaxed its head, though its body still shook with cold. He worked quickly, placing blankets along the horse's back and sides, rubbing its coat to bring back some warmth. He offered water and more feed, careful to move slowly so as not to startle the animal. Gradually the trembling eased. The horse lifted its head, ears pointing forward as it observed the quiet barn. Its eyes softened, losing some of the panic they held before. For a moment, the farmer simply watched it breathe, struck by how incredible it was that a wild creature had chosen to seek him out. But as he studied the horse more closely, something unexpected caught his attention. There was a mark near its shoulder, faint but unmistakable, not a wound, not a natural pattern. It looked like something pressed into its coat long ago. His pulse quickened. He had seen something like that before, years back, tied to a story folks in the region rarely talked about aloud. A story of a wild horse that was said to appear only when something important was on the horizon, something that could change a person's life in ways they never saw coming. He stepped back, unsure what it meant or whether he wanted to believe such tales. Yet the horse stared at him with an intensity that made him feel as though it knew far more than he did. Snow beat against the barn roof, muffling the world outside, but inside the space held a quiet tension. The farmer realized that whatever had brought this horse to him wasn't random. Something deeper was unfolding, something he wasn't prepared for, but couldn't ignore. He stood still, the air warm around him, yet his skin prickling with uncertainty. The horse shifted its weight and watched him with a gaze that felt almost knowing. The storm raged on, sealing the world in cold and darkness. And the farmer sensed that this night, strange as it already was only the beginning of something far larger than he could understand. The question that settled heavy in his mind refused to fade. Why had the horse chosen him? And what awaited him now that he had opened his door to a creature carrying a mystery he couldn't yet see? The farmer stayed in the barn longer than he planned, partly because he wanted to be sure the horse would settle, and partly because something about the animal's presence made it hard to walk away. The warm lantern light flickered over its coat as the horse shifted gently in the stall, still recovering from the brutal cold. The mark on its shoulder kept drawing his eyes back. He tried to convince himself it was just an old scar shaped oddly by time, but deep down he felt there was more to it. The memory of old stories whispered through his mind, stories he had never fully believed but never quite forgotten either. They spoke of a horse that appeared in the worst storms, a horse whose arrival hinted at choices that would change a person's path in ways they never expected. He tried to push the thought aside, forcing himself to focus on practical things. The horse needed rest, water, and warmth. Those were facts he could handle. Mysteries could wait. Still, when he stepped back and looked at the animal again, he found it watching him with an alert patience, as if waiting for him to understand something. He poured another small portion of feed into the trough and stepped out of the stall, taking one last look before turning down the lantern. Outside the barn, the storm had not eased. Snow pushed across the yard in heavy waves, piling against the fences and coating the ground in thick white layers. He pulled his coat tighter and hurried back to the house, grateful for the warmth inside. As he shut the door, he leaned against it for a moment, listening to the wind beat against the walls. His thoughts kept drifting back to the horse. There was a pull he could not explain, a sense that he had stepped into something bigger than a simple rescue. Sleep did not come easily that night. He lay awake, hearing the storm rattle the roof and thinking about how the horse had found its way to his farm in the first place. Something must have driven it through the fierce cold. A wild horse did not wander miles through a freezing night without reason. Maybe it had been chased, or maybe something spooked it. The mark on its shoulder made him wonder if it had once belonged to someone. But if that were true, why was it alone in such harsh weather? When morning finally came, the storm had calmed but left behind thick drifts of snow that rose past his knees as he trudged back to the barn. The cold air stung his face, but the sky was clear, washed with soft light. Inside the barn, the horse stood quietly, ears pointing forward as if it had been listening for his footsteps. It looked stronger, though its coat still held traces of frost. The blankets had done their job, and the warmth had brought some life back to its eyes. He stepped inside the stall, moving slowly to avoid startling it. The horse shifted its weight but stayed calm. He checked the blankets, the feed, the water. Everything seemed fine. For a moment he let his hand rest on the horse's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath. The horse turned its head slightly, meeting his gaze. It felt like another silent message, though he could not understand it. He was still trying to process the moment when he heard the sound of footsteps crunching through snow outside. The barn door opened and a neighbor stepped in, brushing snow off his coat. The farmer looked up in surprise. It was rare for anyone to visit this early, especially after a storm like the one that had rolled in overnight. The neighbor greeted him, then paused as he caught sight of the horse. His expression shifted from curiosity to something closer to concern. He asked where the horse had come from, and the farmer explained as much as he could. The neighbor stepped closer to the stall, studying the horse with narrowed eyes. When he noticed the faint mark on its shoulder, he stiffened slightly. He said he had heard rumors during his supply runs, talk about strange activity near the ridges past the timberline. Some folks swore they saw riders moving through those woods late at night, riding horses that did not behave like ordinary ones. No one knew for sure whether the stories were true, but people were nervous enough to lower their voices when talking about them. The farmer listened in silence, wondering if the mark on the horse's shoulder connected to those rumors. The neighbor lowered his voice, saying he had also heard of a horse that had escaped from a camp somewhere near the edge of the woods. No one knew who the camp belonged to. Some said it was a group looking for a specific kind of horse, one with endurance far beyond normal. Others believed the group trained horses for trade routes that cut through dangerous terrain. But nothing was certain. All he knew was that people had seen shadows moving along the ridges, and tracks had appeared in the snow even when no one was around. The farmer felt the weight of every word settle heavily in his mind. The idea that the horse might be running from someone troubled him deeply. He looked at the animal again and saw a flicker of fear hidden behind its calm stance. The neighbor warned him to be careful. If someone had been looking for this horse, there was a chance they would come searching again. With that warning, the neighbor pulled his coat tighter and headed back into the cold, leaving the farmer standing alone in the barn with the weight of new questions. The farmer spent the next hour tending to chores, but his thoughts kept returning to the horse. If the animal truly came from a group with unknown intentions, he needed to be cautious. But sending the horse back out into the wild was out of the question. It would not survive long in the cold, and something told him the horse had not chosen his farm by accident. The idea unsettled him, yet it also sparked something inside, a sense that he had a responsibility he could not ignore. As the day went on, he continued working, clearing snow, feeding livestock, and repairing a fence damaged by the storm. Every now and then he glanced toward the barn, feeling a quiet pull to check on the horse again. When he finally returned inside the barn in the late afternoon, the horse was standing near the stall gate as if waiting for him. It lifted its head, letting out a soft breath. He stepped closer, noticing how the horse's ears twitched at the sound of steps outside. It made him pause. Someone was approaching again. He walked toward the door, but before he could open it, another knock hit the wood, louder this time. His stomach tightened. He pushed the door open and found two strangers standing in the snow, their faces hidden beneath heavy coats. They asked whether he had seen a horse wandering near the property, their voices calm, but carrying an edge he did not trust. He studied them for a moment before answering. There was something unsettling about the way they stood, their boots barely dusted with snow despite the deep drifts. They waited, watching him closely. He told them he had not seen anything unusual, choosing his words carefully. They exchanged a glance, then asked if he would mind them looking around. He refused politely, explaining the storm had caused plenty of damage and he had work to do. The strangers hesitated, then nodded and walked away, but the farmer watched them lingering near the edge of the property longer than they should have. When they finally disappeared beyond the snow-covered trees, he shut the door and leaned against it, feeling a tightness in his chest. Something was going on, something far beyond a simple runaway horse. He walked back to the stall and looked at the animal again. The horse lifted its head, sensing his unease. Its eyes held a quiet plea, and the farmer understood that whatever trouble lay beyond his fences, it had already reached his doorstep. And now the decision he made next could shape everything that came after. The tension hung heavy between man and horse, and as the cold wind pressed against the barn walls, the farmer realized this was only the beginning. The mystery was opening wider, shadows gathering at the edges of his life, waiting for him to choose what came next. The days that followed moved with a strange heaviness, as if something in the air was quietly shifting, waiting for the right moment to show itself. The wild horse stayed close to the barn now, not inside it, but near enough that the farmer saw him each morning when he stepped out to check the fences. The cold was tightening across the land, sharper than before, and the talk in the small town was that another wave of -30 nights was coming soon. People were stocking firewood, checking their roofs, and preparing for storms. Yet the farmer could not shake the feeling that the storm brewing around him had very little to do with snow. He kept thinking about how the horse had shown up in that bitter cold. It was no normal behavior for a wild horse. Something had pushed that animal to come to him, and the more he thought about it, the more the mystery grew. Even his neighbors noticed. One of them stopped by to buy hay and mentioned he had seen tracks leading down from the ridge, deep and scattered, as if the horse had been chased. The farmer didn't answer. He didn't want to fuel rumors. Still, the thought stayed in his mind like a quiet warning. The farmer tried to distract himself with work. He checked the frozen water lines, repaired a section of fence that had cracked under the cold, and stacked more feed inside the barn. But every time he stepped outside, he caught sight of the wild horse standing still near the trees, watching the land as if guarding something. The animal's breath rose in white clouds each time he let out a slow exhale. The farmer wondered what kind of life the horse had lived before, roaming across open ground with no boundaries. It made him think about his own past, how he had left behind a harder life to start fresh on this land. Maybe both of them carried old scars that were slow to heal. That thought lingered when he found odd tracks behind the barn one morning. They weren't horse tracks. They were human, faint but clear enough in the thin layer of frost. The farmer knelt and studied them quietly. His farm was far from the nearest road, and no one had reason to walk this close without knocking on the door. Something was off. He followed the tracks a little way until they faded near the woods. The wild horse stood at a distance, head raised, ears alert. The farmer felt the same alertness rise inside him. Later that afternoon, when the sky grew heavy with clouds, he sat inside and warmed his hands by the fire. He kept telling himself he was overthinking everything. Maybe someone had passed by looking for shelter or checking wildlife. But deep down he sensed this was tied to the horse. The horse had arrived in desperate cold, and now someone else had moved through the property with no explanation. It couldn't be coincidence. The next days only deepened the tension. At times, the farmer heard distant sounds at night, like something rustling near the tree line. At other times, he caught the wild horse suddenly raising his head, staring toward the ridge as if he sensed danger he couldn't ignore. The farmer found himself watching the shadows more carefully than before. The cold seemed to sharpen the silence, making every noise stand out. One morning, after a long stretch of wind, the farmer found another sign. A thin piece of old rope lay partly buried in snow near the fence. It looked worn, as if someone had dropped it not long ago. Wild horses didn't move with rope. Someone had tried to catch the horse or had tried to haul something across the land. The farmer held the rope in his hands and felt a mix of worry and anger rising inside him. He didn't like the idea of someone trespassing, not just for his own safety, but for the horse that had come to him for help. As the tension grew, the farmer found himself talking to the horse more often, even if from a distance. He would step outside and say things like, "You keeping watch?" Or, "You feel something coming." The horse listened in his own way. He didn't move closer, but he didn't turn away either. There was trust forming between them, slow but real, as if both understood that danger often stays silent until the last moment. While the weather grew harsher, the farmer began to consider that he might not be dealing with a simple wanderer on his property. He remembered stories from local ranchers about men who tried to capture wild horses to sell them across distant counties. Those men didn't care about the animals. They were after profit, not the well-being of the creature. If someone like that had been chasing the wild horse before he reached the farm, then the farmer's land wasn't just shelter. It was the horse's last hope. At the same time, another subplot was forming around the farmer's life. Word had reached him that the bank was reviewing properties in the region because of the heavy winter losses. Some farms might face new restrictions or higher fees. He didn't know if his own place was at risk, but the thought added pressure to his days. The land was all he had left, the place he had rebuilt his life. Losing it wasn't an option. But now, with strange tracks showing up and the possibility of dangerous men nearby, he felt caught between protecting his home and protecting the horse that had trusted him. Each night he checked the locks on the barn, even though the horse still refused to go inside. The wind howled against the windows, and the cold seemed harsh enough to freeze the breath in his chest. Yet the horse held on, standing near the barn as if determined to guard the place that had given him safety. The farmer admired that resilience. He also feared what might have shaped it. The tension reached deeper when the farmer found a broken branch near the far pasture, snapped low as if someone had stepped on it recently. Snow had not filled the mark yet. That meant whoever was watching the property was still close. The farmer's heart tightened. He didn't want trouble, but trouble had already found its way to his doorstep. All he could do now was prepare, stay patient, and wait for the moment when the truth revealed itself. At night he lay awake, thinking about the horse out in the cold and the unknown person moving around his land. The story of how the horse came to him had started with bitter cold, but now it felt like the real cold was the danger creeping closer, step by step, leaving faint footprints behind. The farmer didn't know what would happen next, only that something was coming. Something that would force him to make a choice even bigger than the first one he had made when he let the horse stay. The storm clouds were gathering again, both in the sky and in the quiet tension across the land, and he knew the next turn in this story would not wait much longer. The cold deepened in a way that felt almost personal, as if the land itself was warning the farmer that the calm he wanted would not last much longer. Nights were dropping close to -30 again, and each time he stepped outside, the air felt sharp enough to cut through cloth. Yet the wild horse remained close, refusing to drift back into the wilderness. The farmer began to sense that the horse knew something he did not, something approaching from the shadows of the ridge. Every time the wind shifted, the horse lifted his head, turning his ears toward the dark tree line, watching for movement the farmer could not see. One evening, after finishing his work, he stood outside the barn and watched how the last bit of daylight slid behind the hills. The shadows stretched longer than usual. He had the feeling that someone was out there. Not a distant presence, but a real figure, hiding behind the trees, testing how close they could get. It made the farmer tighten his coat and step closer to the barn door, almost without thinking. The horse moved beside him, not too close, but close enough that he could sense the horse's steady breathing. The animal wasn't restless. He was ready. For days now, strange signs had been appearing. A set of boot tracks partially covered in snow. A piece of metal, like part of a broken latch. A thin strand of rope caught against a fallen branch. None of it made sense to the farmer until he remembered the stories he'd heard from ranchers. Men who chased wild horses, men who caught them to sell them in faraway towns. Men who didn't care about land boundaries or property lines. If those men had tracked the wild horse to his farm, they wouldn't give up easily. And if they saw the horse trusting him, they'd see him as a threat. He began checking the property more often, walking along the fence lines even in the freezing wind. The land felt different now. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It carried tension, as if the whole farm was holding its breath. The horse followed him at times, leaving deep tracks in the snow beside his own. The farmer didn't speak much, but the presence of the horse gave him a strange, steady feeling. It reminded him he wasn't facing this alone. One morning, while he was near the south field, he found a fresh print in the snow. It was a boot mark, clear and sharp, not blurred by melting or wind. It meant someone had been there not long before he arrived. His pulse quickened. He didn't like the idea of someone walking this close to his home without showing themselves. He looked toward the line of bare trees, but nothing moved. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, quiet but heavy. The sky hung low, gray and full of warning. He returned home with the uneasy feeling that eyes were still watching him. That night he couldn't sleep well. Every sound outside made him sit up, listening, a faint creak. A brush of wind, the distant cry of an animal. Each noise carried a hint of something bigger. The wild horse stayed near the barn the whole time, and the farmer sensed the animal wasn't resting either. The next morning brought even more tension. The farmer stepped outside and saw deep marks near one of the fence posts. Someone had leaned on it or climbed over it. The snow there was disturbed in a way that told him it wasn't an animal. He looked around slowly, taking in the stillness of the cold morning. The horse stood with his neck stretched forward, alert and on guard. The farmer followed the disturbed snow a short distance until the tracks vanished into a thicker patch of forest. He didn't know whether to go farther or turn back. Something told him it wasn't safe to follow. For the first time in years he felt the old fear he thought he had left behind. He had come to this land for peace, to rebuild, to live quietly. But now the peace he worked for was being chipped away, piece by piece. He kept thinking about how the horse had chosen his farm. Had the animal known he was being chased for a long time? Had he been running for days before he stumbled onto the farmer's land? If so, the men hunting him must be determined, and determined people often made dangerous choices. Later that day, while checking the frozen water troughs, the farmer heard a faint crack in the distance. Not ice, not branches, something heavier. He turned quickly, scanning the ridge, but once again saw nothing. The horse, however, responded instantly, raising his head high and puffing out a sharp breath. The farmer felt it again, that same tightening in his chest. He knew someone was out there, watching both of them, waiting for the right moment. The nights grew harder. The cold pressed against the walls of the farmhouse, and the wind rattled the windows. Each time the farmer stepped outside with a lantern, he scanned the shadows, expecting to see movement. He started leaving tools closer to the door, not weapons, just things that made him feel prepared. The horse's tracks circled the barn, showing how the animal kept watch even when the world was pitch dark. On one of the coldest nights, the farmer woke suddenly to the sound of something brushing against the side of the house. He rose quickly and grabbed his coat, stepping outside even though the air stung his face. He held the lantern high and looked around. Nothing moved at first. But then he saw the horse standing rigid near the barn, staring at the woods as if he could see through the darkness. The farmer followed the horse's line of sight, and that was when he noticed a faint shape moving between the trees. Not an animal. A person. He felt a surge of fear mixed with anger. Someone was on his land again, and closer than before. He took a step forward, but by the time he reached the open field, the shadow had slipped away, swallowed by the trees. The farmer knew this wasn't random wandering. Someone was testing how close they could get without being caught. Someone was planning something? The next day, he found another clue. Near the back of the barn, half buried in snow, was a small metal hook often used for fastening rope. It looked new. It didn't belong to him. The horse paced near him as he examined it, breathing hard in the cold. The farmer's worry deepened. If the men after the horse were this close, they were preparing to make a move soon. They wouldn't wait forever. The farmer's mind raced through possibilities. Should he drive into town and warn someone? Should he try to move the horse to a safer place? But moving a wild horse wasn't simple, especially in weather this cold. And if he left his land unguarded, he didn't know what he would return to. He wanted to protect the horse, but he also needed to protect his home. The conflict pulled at him from both sides, making each decision feel heavier than the last. The wild horse, sensing the rising tension, stayed near him more than ever. The bond between them had grown without either of them meaning to. The farmer could see trust in the horse's eyes, and responsibility rested heavily on his shoulders. He knew that the men chasing the horse would be ruthless if they finally showed themselves. They wouldn't ask permission. They wouldn't back away. They would take what they wanted and leave damage behind. As the wind grew sharper and the sky darkened again, the farmer felt the story racing toward something inevitable. The land around him seemed to tighten, as if everything was bracing for a moment that could change everything. The presence in the woods was no longer a distant worry. It was close. Too close. The horse sensed it. The farmer sensed it. The whole farm seemed to feel it. He didn't know when the confrontation would happen, but he knew it was coming. Every sign pointed to it. Every bitter gust of wind carried the same message. The land was holding its breath, waiting for the point where everything would collide. And as the farmer stood outside that evening, the wild horse beside him, he felt that the moment was no longer far away. It was almost here, and there was no turning back now. Morning came with a softer kind of cold, the kind that didn't scrape across the skin but settled gently over the land. The storm that had raged through the night finally quieted, leaving everything coated in clean white snow. The farmer stepped outside with careful steps, expecting to find damage, broken fences, or scattered tools. Instead, he found a stillness that felt strangely peaceful. The wild horse stood near the barn, lifting his head the moment he heard the farmer's boots crunch through the snow. The animal looked calm now, as if some heavy weight had been lifted from the air. The farmer walked out farther into the open, checking the land for signs of the men who tried to take the horse. He spotted the tracks left during the night, but they led away from the farm instead of toward it. The prints were staggered and uneven, showing how quickly the men had retreated once the confrontation ended. There were no signs of struggle, no signs that they planned to return. The horse's presence, combined with the farmer's refusal to step aside, had been enough to send them off. For the first time in weeks, the farmer felt his chest loosen. He turned back toward the horse, studying him quietly. The animal had taken shelter near the barn during the storm, and the farmer realized how much trust that choice carried. This once wild and wary horse had begun to see the farm as a place of safety. It surprised him how much that mattered. He hadn't expected to grow attached to an animal that didn't belong to anyone. Yet somewhere between the freezing winds, the watchful nights, and the shared silence, a bond had formed. Inside the barn, the farmer warmed his hands near a small stove and looked around the space. He had repaired it over the years, board by board, never imagining he would one day share it with a horse who had survived storms far harsher than broken boards or missing nails. He gathered hay and fresh water and cleaned the space a bit more than usual. The horse followed him inside without hesitation. For a moment the farmer simply watched him settle, the animal's breath curling in soft clouds that faded slowly. There were things he still needed to understand. Why the men had chased the horse so far. Whether they had a reason that went deeper than profit. But he knew he might never get answers to those questions. What mattered more was that the horse was free now and the danger had passed. The farm felt like a place of starting over again, not a place under threat. Later that afternoon, as the sun fought through the clouds, he walked to the edge of the field where a thin stream ran under a frozen crust. The view stretched far and wide with open land and rolling white hills. The wild horse came up beside him, standing close enough that the farmer could feel the warmth of his body. For a long moment they simply stood still. It felt like the land had been returned to them in a way. Not claimed or conquered, but shared. The farmer thought back to the night the horse had first collapsed near his barn in the -30 cold. He remembered the fear in the animal's eyes and the way he had hesitated before helping. That hesitation now felt like a distant memory replaced by something deeper. Saving the horse had changed him more than he expected. It reminded him that doing the right thing didn't always need a plan or a reason. Sometimes all it took was seeing another living being fighting to survive and refusing to turn away. As the day went on, he repaired parts of the fence that had been weakened by the storm. The horse walked around him quietly, never wandering too far but never crowding him either. It was a rhythm that felt natural. The farmer found himself talking now and then, just simple words, mostly to fill the silence. The horse listened with a calm presence, and he realized how comforting that had become. By evening, the sky shifted into soft shades of gold, casting a warm glow on the snow. The farmer leaned on the fence and took in the view. He knew that if the horse wanted to leave now, he could. The path was clear, the threat was gone. The world beyond the farm stretched for miles. Nothing held the animal here except choice. The farmer waited, wondering what the horse would decide. The horse stepped forward, lowering his head gently against the farmer's shoulder. Not pushing, not demanding, just touching. Then he lifted his head again and looked out toward the hills. The farmer felt a quiet understanding settle inside him. The horse wasn't leaving, at least not yet. He had found comfort here, and the farmer wasn't going to turn him away. The quiet of the evening made every sound sharper. The wind carried the faint crackle of branches. The snow shifted under the horse's hooves. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. Everything felt steady. Everything felt right again. The danger had passed, but the experience left something behind. A sense of purpose. A reminder that even the coldest winter could bring unexpected moments of warmth. Over the next few days, life returned to its usual rhythm, though it felt different now. The farmer woke early, not out of habit but with a sense of anticipation. He cared for the horse, repaired the barn roof, and walked the land without fear for the first time in weeks. The horse grew stronger each day, his coat glossy under the pale sunlight. When he ran, he moved with a freedom that filled the farmer with a quiet sort of pride. When neighbors came by, curious about the tracks they had seen or the storm damage, they were surprised to see the horse standing calmly near the barn. Some said it was rare for a wild horse to choose a person, especially one who lived alone. Others admired the animal's strength and the trust that had formed. The farmer didn't brag about what happened during the storm or the men who had come in the night. He simply said the horse showed up when the cold was harsh and stayed because he wanted to. There was no need to make the story bigger than it already was. As winter slowly loosened its grip, the land began to show signs of change. The snow softened. The days stretched a bit longer, the fields breathed again under the warming sun. The horse explored farther each day but always returned before nightfall. The farmer learned to read his movements, understanding when he wanted space and when he sought company. One morning, the horse trotted over with an energy that wasn't there before. He nudged the farmer lightly, as if asking for something. The farmer opened the gate to the larger pasture and watched the horse race across it with long, powerful strides. It was a sight that stayed with him. The horse was no longer just surviving. He was living. With the seasons shifting, the farmer looked around his land with new appreciation. He realized that saving the horse had not only protected the animal but also helped him find a sense of connection he had been missing since moving there. The cold winter had brought fear and uncertainty, but it had also brought a bond that made the farm feel less lonely. The story of the wild horse who sought shelter in -30 weather became a quiet reminder to the farmer of how unexpected moments could shape a life. It taught him that kindness could ripple outward, even in a world where danger lurked in the shadows. It reminded him that trust, once given, could build something steady and lasting. As spring sunlight touched the farm, he stood near the open field watching the horse graze peacefully. The land was calm. The cold had passed, the danger had gone. What remained was a simple truth. When the horse had turned to him for help, the farmer had made a choice that changed both their lives. It was a story that didn't need grand words or loud endings. It simply needed two beings who found safety in each other. And in that quiet moment, with the horse standing steady and the land stretching out toward a brighter season, the farmer felt grateful for the chance to protect something wild and for the unexpected gift of companionship that followed.